Hey there! In the previous video, we discussed the structure of HTTP requests used to view and manipulate objects with the BigCommerce API. In this one, we will discuss the steps to take to obtain the values of the headers used to authenticate those requests. This is going to be a long video with lots of information, but stick around through the entire OAuth app registration and installation process. By the end, this diagram explaining the process of obtaining OAuth tokens should make a lot more sense. To review, OAuth apps will use the XAuth client and XAuth token headers. The XAuth client header identifies the app, and the XAuth token header is the OAuth token obtained when a user installs the app. To fill in the header values, an app will need to be registered at developer.bigcommerce.com, then installed on a store. But first, there are a few steps to take before beginning the registration process. Make sure you have access to the user account listed as the store owner, or that you will be able to work with whoever does use that account to complete some steps. You will also need to have an AuthCallback URL set up. This URL is sent a GET request with some query parameters when a user clicks the Install button on the app marketplace. Since the GET request is sent by the user's browser, this can be a local URL during app development. But apps that are published in the app marketplace must have a publicly accessible AuthCallback URL. Additionally, apps that are published in the app marketplace must respond to this GET request with some HTML that will be displayed in an iframe in the control panel. This response is not necessary to register or install an app during development, but it will be needed before the app is approved for publication in the BigCommerce app marketplace. There are 3 query parameters in the GET request sent to the AuthCallback URL when the user clicks Install. We'll look further into how these parameters are processed after we cover app registration, but let's introduce them now. The code parameter passes a temporary code from BigCommerce to the app. This code will later be exchanged for a permanent OAuth token. The context parameter contains a unique code used to identify the store that is installing the app. The syntax is stores/store hash. The slash is URL encoded, so the resulting value is stores%2f, store hash. This should be stored by the app, so it can be used in the request line as part of the relative URL for future requests to this store's API. The scope parameter lists the scopes requested by the app. Scopes determine which resources can be accessed or manipulated. While users cannot choose which scopes the app requests, it is best practice to ensure this list matches the scope selected when the app was registered as an additional layer of verification that the request is legitimate. The third piece to have in place before registering an app is a LoadCallback URL. Just like the AuthCallback URL, this can be a local URL during development. For apps that are not meant to be published, this URL does not need to be active. However, apps that are published in the app marketplace must have a publicly accessible LoadCallback URL. The purpose of the LoadCallback URL is to allow you to feed an app UI into the BC control panel. When a user clicks on the app's icon to open it after the app has been installed, a GET request is sent to this URL. We will discuss the correct way of handling this GET request and responding to it in a later video. For now, you will just need a URL we can enter as the LoadCallback URL during registration. Once you have access to the store owner account, an AuthCallback URL that can receive query parameters, and a LoadCallback URL, you can begin registering your app. Begin by logging in at developer.bigcommerce.com using the store owner email address and click My Apps. If this is the first time you have accessed this section with your account, you will need to approve the developer permissions to proceed. From here, click on Create an App, type in the name of your app, and click Create. This opens the App Summary tab where you will enter details like your name and contact information. The Partner Portal username and Partner ID are not required to register an app, but will be required in order for an app to be published in the app marketplace. I'm going to skip the remaining fields in the App Summary, Details, and Launchbar tabs, which are used to advertise your app in the app marketplace, and click on the Technical tab. Here, we will enter our AuthCallback and LoadCallback URLs. The uninstall callback URL is not required, and we will leave it empty for now. Next, scroll down and choose the OAuth scopes for your app. Once you have entered the callback URLs and selected the necessary scopes, click Update and Close. Next, click View Client ID. This will display your app's client ID and client secret. The client ID is the value your app will use for the Auth client header and HTTP requests. The client secret will be used when generating OAuth tokens. Make sure to never share or expose your app's client secret because it is also used for request validation. Now that the app is registered and the client ID and client secret have been generated, we can install the app. Begin by logging into the store as the store owner and open the Apps menu. Click on My Apps, then My Draft Apps. Then click Learn More on your app. This will bring you to the Install button that sends the Auth callback request. Click the Install button, then confirm the requested scopes to trigger the Auth callback request. If your Auth callback URL is not responding with content, you will see a blank screen. While it is not required to respond with content to install the app, apps that are published in the App Marketplace must respond with content to display in the control panel. If you are using a local server and a self-signed SSL certificate, you will see an untrusted certificate warning at this point. Follow the links to tell the browser to trust the certificate and continue. At this point, the app should have received a GET request with the code, context, and scope parameters at the Auth callback URL. If you did not, check to ensure your server can accept encrypted connections via TLS protocol. Once the app has received the GET request, it will need to send a POST request to login.bigcommerce.com/OAuth2/token to exchange the code for the OAuth token. The POST must use the content type header specifying the media type as a URL encoded query string. The request body needs to be a query string that includes the client ID and client secret provided by BigCommerce when the app was registered, the code, context, and scope parameters received in the Auth callback request, a grant type parameter with the value authorization code, and a redirect URI parameter using the app's Auth callback URL as the value. Let's take a look at an example post sent after receiving the previous example GET request at the Auth callback URL. We can see the host is login.bigcommerce.com and the relative path is /OAuth2/token. The content type header is present and uses the MIME type for URL encoded data as its value. In the body, I've used a made-up client ID and client secret. These should match the ID and secret provided when the app was registered. The code, scope, and context from the Auth callback request are used. The grant type is set to authorization code, and the redirect URI points to the Auth callback URL. Now we're just one step away from getting the OAuth token for the store owner account. Login.bigcommerce.com will give a POST response. The response body contains JSON with an access token. This is the OAuth token that the app will use as the value of the Auth token header for the user going forward. So make sure this value is stored securely. The POST response will also include the scope, which should match the scope used in the Auth callback and POST requests. The user that clicked Install will be identified by a user ID and email address. Store these values so the app can identify the user when they load or uninstall it later. Finally, the response will include the same value for context that is used to identify the store in the Auth callback and POST requests. Before we move on, let's review the diagram I showed you at the beginning of this video. First, the app must be registered with an Auth callback URL and a load URL. This provides the client ID and client secret for the app. Then, the user clicks the Install button on the App Marketplace within their store's control panel. The user is prompted to allow the app to access their store using the scopes chosen during the app registration. Once the user confirms the requested scopes, BigCommerce sends a GET request to the app's Auth callback URL containing a temporary code. If the app is going to be published in the App Marketplace, it must respond to the GET request with HTML that is rendered in the user's browser. Along with the response, the app should send a POST request to login.bigcommerce.com with the client ID, client secret, and temporary code along with the store hash and a few other values. BigCommerce will respond to the POST request with an OAuth token that must be securely stored and values that identify the user and the store that have just installed the app. Now that we've covered the steps involved in obtaining the authentication token for OAuth apps, let's discuss the steps for obtaining the token for a basic Auth app. Basic Auth apps use an authorization header. The value of this header is obtained by using a username, and a token that is specific to a single store. We'll start by generating the username and token. To do this, navigate to the Legacy API settings under the Advanced Settings menu of a store's control panel. Then click Create a Legacy API account and type in a username. Copy the auto-generated token on this page and be sure to hit the Save button to activate the credentials. Next, this username and token will need to be combined to create the value of the authorization header. Start by creating a single string composed of the username and API token separated by a colon. Next, base64 encode the string. Then prepend the word BASIC to the beginning with a space. It is important to capitalize the B in BASIC. You now have your authorization header value used for basic auth apps. Here is how it would look in plain text. I know this has been a lot of information, so kudos for sticking it out. Hopefully, you now feel more comfortable with the registration and installation process used to obtain tokens for OAuth apps and the steps involved in creating and processing the tokens for basic auth apps. Take a break, you've earned it. Then check out the rest of the series.